To get this started, one of the things that I had to give some thought to is, where did this whole business of the country of Czechoslovakia really start? Because obviously, much history went by in which these different cultures in Europe, of which we have numbered here today, really didn't coalesce in any kind of meaningful way. And so a good starting point probably was the Great Moravian Empire. Sten Pekka made a note to me today, which I'll speak to later, which surprised me but was quite accurate. Great Moravian Empire, of course, which went back, I have to do a little bit of reading here for my own benefit, went back to 9th century AD, and basically was the ancestors of the Czechs and the Slovaks, and of course these were united at that time in the Great Moravian Empire. So at one point in time, the Czechs and the Slovaks were in fact bound together politically and even ethnically in some ways in the Great Moravian Empire. In 907, however, the Hungarian Empire invaded and they broke off. And at that particular time, we basically ended up with the separation of Slovakia from the Bohemian crown lands. So Bohemia basically was still under a series of princes and different kinds of Bohemian kings over a large period of time, but it was very much dynasties that persisted in that part of the what broke off away from the Great Moravian Empire. Hungary obviously was not quite the same. That was a much different kind of a situation, and basically the two countries at that point became separated to the point where they were operating separately culturally in many other ways. From 810th to the 15th century, the Czech inhabitants of the Bohemian kingdom were very powerful. They developed as a very powerful political and military entity, and culturally was one of the most, basically the most advanced nations in Europe. And this period was known as the Golden Age of medieval Bohemia. And during this period, Prague University, which was founded, believe it or not, 1348, was the first university in Central Europe, east of France and north of the Alps, and is still one of the oldest universities in Europe in continuous operation. So at that particular time, the culture in this area had achieved a very high degree of importance, both culturally and politically. And so essentially Bohemia was developing as a very strong presence in Europe. The castle in Prague, for those of you who have seen it, may not appear that old sometimes, but the history of the Prague castle also goes back to 1357. For those of you who travel in Europe, it's something to really look at. Fortunately, none of this was ever damaged during the Second World War. So what we're looking at when we look at, if I can get my finger on the right place here, Charles Bridge and the castle go back to the 1300s, which is really an amazing situation because much of that is still intact. Jan Hus, a popular reformist and priest and a rector of Charles University, he basically developed an anti-papal kind of view. He became an antagonist of the church and sort of anti-clerical. And so he started to reform the church, much to the dismay of the Roman Catholic Church, and has started holding the Mass in the vernacular in the Czech language, which of course the church was holding in Latin. And so the church very much opposed him in many ways. This led to the condemnation of Hus as a heretic, and they burned him at the stake in 1415. His death resulted in a revolt against the church, divisions in the country between the Catholics and the Hussites, who had stuck with Hus, and sparked the decades and decades of church battles. Because of the internal and political conflicts in the Bohemian estates, so the country, the area of Bohemia, what we talked about earlier, were made up of these different estates. And each of these states basically they were, again, founded by hierarchical people, kings, dukes, and the whole area had been divided up in that kind of way. And basically, they didn't get together very well, they didn't get along very well, and as a result, they were unable to establish a continuous dynasty. In 1526, the Bohemian Estates accepted the Habsburg ruler as the monarch, but this led to the establishment of an absolute Habsburg monopoly, and as a result of that, of course, much of that led to the grief that led up to the Second World War. In 1616, the Habsburgs opposed the demands of the Bohemian estates and went to war, defeating the Bohemian estates at the White Mountain in 1620, which was the start of the 30 Years' War, which is a major point in history in Europe, and included the substitution of the German language for Bohemian. So basically, the Habsburgs, in all official correspondence, in all business, everything was conducted in German at that time, but the Czechs still maintained their language. After the defeat of the Battle of White Mountain, the entire Czech leadership was either killed or went into exile. So basically, they disappeared from the political scene. During the 17th and 18th century, the remnants of the Bohemian kingdoms were abolished, and the Czech lands were incorporated into Austria with both political and the intellectual suppression of the Czechs. But the Czechs, again, continue to maintain their language and the other parts of their culture that they were trying to maintain. At the end of the 18th century, a Czech nationalist movement began to emerge, and the Nationalist Revival started to bring back the Czech language, culture, and national identity back to life, including the publications of the first dictionary of the Czech language. Now remember, they had Charles University at one point in time, and so during all of these years, in spite of the suppression of the Czechs, they still were trying to maintain their identity as a nationalist movement. Numerous Czech institutions were established during this period, and this celebration of the Czech history and culture included the building of the National Theater, a very important place in Prague, and which opened in 1883, and the National Museum in 1890. The Industrial Revolution in the 19th century had led to the building of a railway between Vienna and Prague in 1845. And in that case, there was an increase in Prague's Czech population as people began to move to the city from the country, and they began to increase their demands for national and constitutional rights. Remember, again, they were had to speak the German language, and were basically still highly suppressed at the point of time. Czechs were able to obtain an acknowledgement of the Bohemian language and permission for the establishment of schools and the extension of educational opportunities. And as a result of this fight for education, the Bohemians became one of the most best educated ethnic groups in Europe. And Bohemia became the leader of industrial production in Austria-Hungary. Might add that when the Czechs came to the United States in the years prior to 1918, in the early immigration years, The literacy rate of the Czechs was 98%. 98% of the Czechs were literate in comparison to more like 50% for most of the other ethnic groups that came to the United States. Austria, now with about 7 million Bohemians who wanted some progress and better education than the 9 million Germans who were in this territory now, with greater men in Czechs had greater men in literature, science, music, fine arts, and they began demanding equal rights with the Germans. But the German nobility and bureaucracy in Vienna considered the Slavs as minderwertig, or of less value than the Germans, and they blocked any concessions that the Czechs had requested for equal rights. As the oppression of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire increased and the probability of war began to loom, millions of Czechs and Slovaks began to emigrate to other countries, including the United States. Beginning in 1908, the German deputies of the Diet of Bohemia adopted a policy of obstruction and would not permit any business whatsoever to be transacted by the Bohemian Diet. In 1913, the government dissolved the Bohemian Diet and established an imperial commission to administer the local affairs of Bohemia. And you can see that this is starting to develop into quite a bit of conflict. The history of the Slovak nation, of course, as we go back to that, because eventually these two groups had come together, began even before the emergence of Slovak as a district. They had a distinct literary language in the 19th century. From the 11th century, Hungary ruled with what is now Slovakia, and the Slovak ancestry was identified as inhabitants of Upper Hungary or the highlands rather than by their Slavic language. So the Slovaks up to this point didn't really even have an identity within the political structure under which they were maintained. Despite the Hungarian drive to modularization, which was the try to get everybody to start speaking Hungarian, just as the Austrians had tried to get German as a common language in their territory. The multi-ethnic population in their kingdom by the 19th century, the Slovaks had created a distinct identity linking themselves basically with the 9th century Slavic kingdom, that is the Moravian kingdom that existed at that time. So between the Moravian kingdom and this time, again, Slovaks didn't have much to say, but they still had maintained their identity as such. As part of the movement, they joined forces with a part of the Czechs were also going to this nationalistic movement also. And so during this period, prior to World War, they combined themselves to try to convince the future victorious powers to recognize the new state of Czechoslovakia. And then after the war, in Slovakia materializing as a geopolitical unit at this point, but within the country of Czechoslovakia. And it was not necessarily with the same rights as the Czechs. And so there was always a little bit of difference that existed between the Czechs and the Slovaks for that reason. June 28th, Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. June 28th, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. And of course, that was the start of the First World War. Serb student assassinates Archduke and his Duchess, and basically the war started. In the United States, in which there were large quantities or large populations of Czechs and Slovaks, they began to have these protest rallies all over the country. New York, Cleveland had one. July 28, 1914, first one, Czechs, Americans held a protest demonstration in Chicago in Pilsen Park and established the Serbian Red Cross to aid Serbia and its army as proof of the Pan-Slavic unity. So Pan-Slavic unity, which started between the Czechs and the Slovaks at this point, began to get reinforced in this country by the same groups. And this was followed by similar...
People in the back can't hear you. Use the mic.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize and will continue on to use the mic. I thought I was getting an volume to it, but not. And so these demonstrations had occurred in Cleveland and other U.S. cities basically during the same period. First, one of the first things that occurred at this point in time was after months of discussions regarding cooperation towards support for a Czechoslovak nation, Česká národní sdružení and the Slovenská liga met in Cleveland on October 22nd, 23rd, 1915, and again, it was the first signing of the document, the Cleveland Agreement, which reciprocally recognized each other as the official representatives of the Bohemian and Slovakia, Slovaks in America, Bohemians and Slovaks in America, and agreeing to associate the Czechs and Slovaks into a federal union of states. There was a publication that had been in existence for a number of years called the Bohemian Review, which became the official documents by which these people began to transmit the information and the progress they were making toward freedom. And they changed the name of that then at that point to the Czechoslovak Review at that period. Then the Cleveland Conference, in its joint conference, adopted the Bohemian Review as their official publication organ under the name of the Czechoslovak Review. For those of you who have an opportunity to go back and read that, it's been translated, and if you go back and read it, you can really get some very interesting historical facts and just what was really happening at that time. The Bohemian Slovak Conference in Cleveland, Cleveland Agreement, October 22nd and 23rd, 1915. This is a copy of it, and I'm not going to go through the items, but they're available to take a look at in boards that we have. This is the group that met, the second meeting of that group, Czechoslovak National Council. It's interesting, I happened to put a flag that was published in Slovakia, which was giving tribute to the Cleveland, this Bohemian and Slovak Cleveland Agreement. And they had actually published or printed a stamp that was used in Slovakia. In December 1914, Thomas Masaryk, basically, he had been working towards independence, immigrated to Italy, started to work on the concept of an independent Czech state in collaboration with a secret Czech organization called the Mafia. Sort of an interesting name for it, because it has implications that are a little different than what they were at that time. With Edvard Beneš at the head, in which he established a network of communications, collected secret information, and encouraged politicians not to support the Austria-Hungary. In Geneva, on the anniversary of Hus's martyrdom, July 6, 1915, Masaryk called for the creation of an independent Czechoslovak state. In September 1915, Edvard Beneš joined Masaryk in Paris, where Milan Stefanik, a Slovak, basically who was serving in the French Air Force, added his contacts with the French, and using his influence to do that, he was able to get the French army to accept the Legionnaires who would volunteer to join the army under the political leadership of this new council that had been developed. In Europe, in February 1918, Czech committee became the Czechoslovak National Council, which is the beginning of the government, CNC, with Masaryk as chairman, Joseph Durek and Stefanik vice chairman, and Beneš in charge of the Secretariat in Prague. And this is recognized by the Allies as the de facto government in exile for the future Czechoslovakia. Durek was very much involved with the Russians at the time, and as a result of the revolution in Russia, he basically lost power and he sort of disappeared from this, what eventually became a triumvirate of people that were directly involved in the formation of the country. July 4th, 1917, the Alliance of Czech Catholics, who were late in joining, incidentally, joined with the Czech National Alliance to work toward the common goals shared by both organizations, including the goals of Czech independence. And then December 7th, 1917, the United States declared war on Austria-Hungary, and by this time, approximately 300 Czech, Moravians, and Slovaks from the United States had crossed the border to join the Canadian Army to fight in Europe. One of the problems that the Czechs and the Slovaks had in this country, at that point they were not citizens of the United States, and in fact they were enemies because of their citizenship in Austria-Hungary, so they were not able to join the U.S. Army. And so they had some difficulty really getting started in that process. A song written by a Slovak, Samuel Tomaszek, in 1834 under the title Hey Slovaks, Hey Slováci, became a rallying cry for the Slav nationalism and pan-Slavic sentiment, especially in Slavic lands governed by Austria, and was sung by Slav soldiers on the war front to let opposition Slavs of their pan-Slavic feelings. So across the battle lines, you would have they would be singing the song Hey Slavs, and the Russians and the other Serbs who they were fighting against knew that they were fighting people who were really also Slavs, and it made a difference in the fighting. Melody is based on a mazurek, which is a Polish song, but the song became the anthem of the physical, educational, and political movement, and is still considered to be the second unofficial anthem of many Slavic peoples. The song itself. Unfortunately.
Sorry about that.
Just an interesting sidelight to basically what was happening at that particular point in time, and the way that people. There we go. I got it. Thank you. You have to keep reminding me. On December 16th, 1917, the Allied powers had included in their war aims the liberation of Czechoslovakia, and France officially recognized the Czechoslovak military units as the Czechoslovak Army, Czech and Slovak legions, and Stefanik visited Cleveland and other U.S. cities to recruit volunteers for the Western Front. They actually had set up a recruiting station across the street and a short ways down by the Methodist, well, it's not a Methodist church, at a place called Probolov Hall, and that was the station in which people would volunteer for this French army that was forming up. Pittsburgh Agreement then signed by the Bohemian and National Alliance, the Alliance of Czech Catholics and Slovak Liga in the presence of Masaryk on May 31st, 1918, confirmed the Czechs and Slovaks' support for formation of an independent Czechoslovak state. At that point, they met again in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh Agreement was signed, and essentially it formalized what was going to happen. This is a picture of President Masaryk in front of Probolov Hall in June 1918. This was the time that he had visited Cleveland to talk at a mass meeting over at the Gray's Armory. This is a picture of the first groups of Czechoslovak American Legionnaires who would leave Cleveland. And again, one of the problems they had was that because they were Austrian-Hungarian citizens and were not eligible to join the American Army, also were considered enemies of the United States. And as a result of that, the first group who would volunteer here in Cleveland had to go in civilian clothes, go to New York. They were given their physicals on a ship, a French ship, before they were put into the army. And then at that point, they were issued uniforms and became part of the French Legionnaires, or the Czechoslovak Legionnaires in the French army. Another thing that was occurring at the same time, and some of you probably have remembered this. I have a grandmother who happened to be what was called a Vichelki, part of the Vichelki. Vichelki means bees. And the bees, what they did is they acted as the women. My grandmother used to wear a white uniform that looked like a nurse's uniform almost. It was all white. And they would gather up boxes and boxes of supplies to send over in support of the people in Bohemia and Slovakia, who were under great duress, and also to support the soldiers. At one point, it is estimated in 1918 dollars, it was $2 million that was collected at Groveloff Hall to ship over to assist these people over in Europe. $2 million in 1918 dollars, to give you some idea how much effort was put in. And this is Cleveland alone. What happened at this point then, Declaration of Independence, signed, Czech Declaration of Independence, signed in Philadelphia in the presence of Wilson, and basically the U.S. played a very strong role in supporting the Czech Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence of Czechoslovakia basically is drafted around the same as our Constitution, or our Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to read it, but this is it. And you can see the highlight given to Wilson and to the triumvirate, who were, at that point, the de facto government of Czechoslovakia. And this is a picture, and this is an excerpt from the Zizek's book, when the Czechoslovak legions got back to Prague after fighting, and this was after the war ended. And it's just, he's admiring the fact that they were welcomed by huge crowds. They were given bread and kielbasa, and they were put up in the school, I guess, and great jubilation. Czech's Republic is born. This is a copy of the Svět, the day that it was became history. Cleveland, Czechoslovakia stopped. And basically we had the country. However, I think many people don't realize that the borders, just about done, the borders were not completely identified at that point. And so the Paris Peace Conference meant to try to deal with some of these problems. And of course, so some of the country borders had not been defined until after the Paris Peace Conference. One of them was the area around Teschen, up in Moravia. That was they were fighting for another year or two afterwards with the Polish. A lot of loss of life up there until the territory was finally divided across the Oder River. The other area that there was a problem was in Russian, went too far again. The Carpatho-Russian area, in which there was really no country. This was with the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, the West Ukrainian People's Republic wanted to claim this area of the Russian territory, but so it ended up with a great deal of conflict. Eventually, as part of the Paris Peace Conference, it was transferred over to what became Czechoslovakia, and then this ultimately was what Czechoslovakia became at that particular point in time. Basically, the idea originally was Svornost. However, as we all know, the struggle for ethnic autonomy continues, and each of us in our own ethnic ways still maintains our unity as individual cultures within what was, at one point, the country of Czechoslovakia, even though we are now separated. That does it.